If Gary had never come home, he would probably be dead.
Who the fuck starts a conversation like that? I just sat down.
Sorry. But honestly, if Gary hadn't come back, this SpongeBob episode would have been the most disturbing one in the entire series. Even more disturbing than when SpongeBob mutilated his body for his Halloween costume. So, if you're ready to hear the tragedy behind this episode, buckle up, cause shit is gonna go down. Let's start by going over what happened in the episode. SpongeBob had to feed Gary because they ran out of food, but just as he was about to, he got a special edition Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy paddleball set. Actually, fun fact, this paddleball game was made by Nickelodeon Inc. So if you already knew that, congratulations! You win some ham and cookies!
So good and tasty?
Anyway, the game includes the Dirty Bubble Challenge, which is to hit the ball
29,998,559,671,349 times in a row.
What? What the fuck?
So, SpongeBob wants to beat the challenge too, and in the process, he eats Gary like if nothing. Bro, why? Okay, wait. I know this has nothing to do with the video, but like, is this challenge even possible? Apparently yes, because remember, Patrick says he did it. So, how long would Gary have gone unfed while SpongeBob was doing the challenge? In reality, if we calculate that SpongeBob hits the ball 3 times per second, it will take him 317,192 years to finish. So yeah, pretty sure Patrick imagined the whole thing. Gary gets fed up and decides to leave in search of a home where he's actually loved. So he hops on a snail-red bus, and on the way, he meets Grandma, who mistakes him for Miss Tuffsy. So she feeds him like she's gonna eat him in Christmas dinner. Meanwhile, SpongeBob's out there looking for Gary and getting so depressed he becomes emo. Eventually, Gary comes back home. Well, that was a beautiful story. But now let's flip the script. What if for any reason or whatever, Gary never returned? Honestly, no matter how you look at it, the story turns out super tragic. Let's start with SpongeBob's side. Back then, he felt completely guilty for wanting to spend 300,000 years doing the Dirty Bubble Challenge and leaving Gary hanging. As we saw in the episode, he was seriously crushed and tried everything to gain attention and find him. But would SpongeBob get so depressed that he just leaves himself to die? Would he lose his job at the Krusty Krab? Wow, this sounds like a creepypasta, right? But no, not really. Even though he looked deeply depressed by losing Gary, the truth is, SpongeBob was probably going to do his best to move on as soon as possible. And I know it sounds super harsh coming from SpongeBob, but he actually let us know this at the end of the episode.
I gotta try to forget Gary.
There, he's basically saying his last goodbye to Gary so he can move on and continue his life. Maybe he'd get a new pet. Another snail, maybe? Though, who knows if he'd even like the new one. He'd probably just keep comparing them thanks to the frustration left by Gary's loss. Gary used to do this, Gary meowed like this, Gary rubbed my feet, you get it. Or maybe he'd get a pet rock like Patrick did. But let's be honest, SpongeBob would get bored in just 2 seconds. Maybe he'd try again with a different pet, like in that one episode where he tried to get a pet worm. But we all know how that went. Most likely SpongeBob would end up completely alone, or maybe find a sea pet that barely moves and only needs food to survive. Honestly, he'd just go on with his life as usual. And honestly, that sounds very possible. We rarely see Gary and SpongeBob actually hanging out. Most of the time, Gary's off doing his own thing, while SpongeBob is being SpongeBob. But okay, now let's talk about the most important part, the one that is really gonna destroy our brain. What would have happened to Gary? Let's start by looking and analyzing Grandma. I think the first time we saw this episode, we probably thought she was fattening up the snails to eat them. But nearly 20 years later after this episode was released, I've realized she didn't mean Gary any harm. In reality, she was gonna kill them. With love! The 15 snails she had before all had different fates. Some may have escaped, like the real Miss Tuffsy, who, if you didn't notice, she was probably already in Grandma's house and managed to flee. Then, Grandma found Gary instead of Tuffsy. Some other snails might have died of old age, others from sickness, the same fate that might have awaited Gary. You see, this grandma just wanted to spoil her snails. She gave them dessert and tasty food like she might have done with her grandkids once. Or maybe she never had grandkids. Maybe her children ditched her really fast once she got obsessed with snails. The truth is, this grandma had a tragic story behind. Whatever the case, all she did was feed and feed them, thinking that's how she showed them how much she loved all their snails. And honestly, it's not a bad thing, guys. There are plenty of times in life where people try to do something good for others or even pets and end up hurting them instead. A super clear example is with cats. There are a lot of popular cat foods out there that actually do a ton of harm and can even cause serious health issues. I don't think their owners meant to do that. And it's the same thing that would have happened to Gary. But really, there are two different scenarios here. Either Gary wouldn't have been able to escape from the grandma's house, or maybe he did escape, but just never came back to SpongeBob. Maybe because Gary never saw the posters and thought SpongeBob still didn't love him. First, let's start with what would have happened if Gary had stayed at Grandma's house. The truth is, in the episode we saw that Gary started gaining a lot of weight in a super short amount of time. Every day he was eating pancakes, ham and eggs, cookies, you know, all the classic grandma foods to get you nice and chubby. In about 2 or 3 days, Gary's shell cracked from how fat he'd gotten. And if you remember the other shells the grandma had stored in her closet, the same thing happened to other snails too. So yeah, I'd say that after 2 or 3 weeks of eating like that, Gary would have collapsed. Maybe had heart issues, or just gotten so fat he couldn't even crawl anymore. He probably would have only been able to move a couple feet before just giving up and waiting to die. Yup, Gary would have died of being too fat. And the second scenario isn't any less miserable for Gary. Let's say he managed to escape and run away from the grandma. But first of all, Gary had already encountered street snails, and we saw how scared he was. I mean, he's been a house pet his whole life and doesn't know anything about the outside world. Plus, we already saw he's not good at finding food on his own. When SpongeBob spent those 10 days trying to complete the Dirty Bubble Challenge, the only thing Gary ate was sand. And that's it. So here, Gary probably would have starved to death. After what happened with Grandma, I doubt he'd trust anyone else ever again. Now, the big question is, how long would Gary last without eating? Considering he's a sea snail, he could probably go several weeks without food before dying. The sea snails store energy pretty well to help them survive. And since he filled up big time with all the food Grandma gave him, we'd say he'd last about 2 to 4 weeks before starving to death. So yeah guys, we should all be glad Gary did come back home. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure this SpongeBob episode would have ended up as a lost episode or a full-blown creepypasta. Anyway, what do you think would have happened to Gary and SpongeBob if Gary never came back home? Let us know in the comments.